They saw themselves as iconoclasts, the empiricists did, fighting rationalist pretensions, and that, I think, was one of the healthiest things about empiricism. They made the world responsible for teaching us the way the world was, and refused to accept any other source of knowledge as genuine.
D. This is C, D, A, B. Right, C.
How do we acquire knowledge? And how do we determine if what we think we know is true? Two opposing theories of knowledge gained prominence in 17th century Europe. René Descartes and later rationalists believed that pure reason could grasp truths about the world, truth that would be as unshakable as our knowledge of geometry. John Locke and later empiricists disputed such claims and argued that all knowledge of the world must come through the senses and experience.
The rationalists pretended to a certainty about the world that empiricists thought was very unlikely, given the way that we're embedded in the world and the access we have to it. If you wanted something that was substantive, something that told you about the way the world was, then lose your hopes for certainty, my friend. And that means forget pure reason as a possible route to knowledge. You're going to get down here in the trenches with the rest of us, messing with empirical reality to try to find out what structure it actually has.
From an empiricist point of view, how do we know these are apples? By judging from apples we have seen and smelled and tasted in the past. How do we know about gravity? By observing falling objects. How do we learn about minerals on Mars? Through sophisticated tools that extend our powers of observation. John Locke's An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, published in 1690, might be called the Empiricist Manifesto. It opens with a long attack on the rationalist position that many ideas are innate, present in the mind from birth. Locke compares the mind at birth to a tabula rasa, a blank tablet.
Let us suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence comes it by that vast store which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted with almost endless variety? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word, from experience. In that, all our knowledge is founded.
So this was a controversial hypothesis in his time. In many ways, it's been widely accepted, or it strikes people as fairly commonsensical, but it was not regarded as the standard view in his own age. And Locke thought of himself as pioneering a new program. He brings to it some of the excitement of someone with a new research program.
He was a close friend of Newton and Boyle's. He was associated with the Royal Society Circle. This was a place where very exciting things were happening in the experimental sciences. And what Locke wanted to do was to understand this knowledge, to systematize it, to make sense of it, and to arrive at a better account of human beings and their relation to the world than he felt had been given by the outdated Aristotelian view.
The colors, tastes, and sounds provided by our senses are only the raw material of knowledge. Locke calls them simple ideas. The mind can play with these simple ideas like cards in a deck.
When the understanding is once stored with these simple ideas, it has the power to repeat, compare, and unite them, even to an almost infinite variety, and so can make, at pleasure, new complex ideas.
Locke didn't think that a concept of justice or the concept of a triangle came to us ready-made from the senses, but he thought we could explain how we acquired the idea of justice or the idea of a triangle by processing in various ways what the senses do provide us with, namely sensations.
But for all its power to process simple ideas into complex ideas, the understanding can't create simple ideas of its own. It can't slip innate idea cards into the game.
But it is not in the power of the most exalted wit or enlarged understanding by any quickness or variety of thought to invent or frame one new simple idea in the mind.
In proposing that information about the world can come into the mind only through sense perceptions, Locke distanced the mind from the external world.
Locke starts from the idea that when we represent the world, what we do is we have a proper object of perception that's nearer to us than, say, the hand we look at, and that is our mental image of the hand. Once he's done that, he sets up a gap between the image of the hand and the real hand. And it becomes very difficult for him to bridge that gap and to claim that what he knows about the hand as perceived, the mental image, is really there in the hand as it is.
Locke's own response to the gap was to assert that the senses do make true copies of things that exist in the world.
When our senses do actually convey into our understandings any idea, we cannot but be satisfied that there doth something at that time really exist without us, which doth affect our senses, and by them give notice of itself to our apprehensive faculties.
The next major empiricist, George Berkeley, would make the gap between the external world and our mental images of it central to his philosophy.
Berkeley studied the philosophy of Locke at Trinity College, Dublin, became excited with it, but he felt that Lockean philosophy posed a threat to religion. Berkeley felt that if you admitted the existence of material substance existing over and above minds, then that led to skepticism and also to atheism. Berkeley's solution, therefore, was to say that bodies are simply ideas or collection of ideas.
By sight, I have the ideas of light and colors. By touch, I perceive hard and soft, heat and cold, motion and resistance. Smelling furnishes me with odors, the palate with tastes, the hearing conveys sounds. And as several of these are observed to accompany each other, they come to be marked by one name, and so to be reputed as one thing, signified by the name apple. Other collections of ideas constitute a stone, a tree, a book, and the like.
The book consists in nothing over and above a collection of ideas in my mind. There is no such thing as material substance where that is supposed to be something that does exist independently of human minds.
Like Locke, Berkeley did not press the question of whether we can know if our sense perceptions are backed up by anything outside the mind. His way around the problem was to argue that all the collections of ideas that we loosely call things do in fact exist in the mind of God. The third major empiricist, David Hume, would not find or seek refuge in religion. Hume's empiricism started from the same premise as Locke's and Berkeley's. All knowledge of the world must come from experience. He underscores this point by emphasizing how much more vivid our sense impressions are than the copies we make of them by mere thinking.
Everyone will readily allow that there is a considerable difference between the perceptions of the mind. When a man feels the pain of excessive heat or the pleasure of moderate warmth, and when he afterwards recalls to his memory this sensation or anticipates it by his imagination. These faculties may mimic or copy the perceptions of the senses, but they can never entirely reach the force and vivacity of the original sentiment. The most lively thought is still inferior to the dullest sensation.
An important influence on Hume is not just the philosophy of Locke, but the science of Newton, which had great prestige in the age. Hume thought that Newton had given an incredible science of the physical world, had come up with the laws of the physical world, such as the law of attraction. And Hume's great ambition was to do for human nature, for the human world, if you like, what Newton had done for the physical world. Hume wanted a science of human nature. He wanted to explain why we think and believe in the way we do, why we feel in the way we do, why we have the passions that we do, and why we make the moral judgments that we do.
Locke had attacked the rationalist notion of innate ideas. Hume would attack the core of rationalism, the belief that reason has remarkable powers. The rationalists maintained that reason, by itself, could provide us with knowledge of what the world is like. But for Hume, the mind, without experience, can know nothing about the physical world. Consider the motion of billiard balls on a table. They seem to move in perfect geometric patterns. The momentum and angle of impact seem to transfer from one ball to the next. A rationalist would hold that reason can analyze how billiard balls will move a priori without prior experience. Hume disagrees.
We fancy that, were we brought on a sudden into this world, we could at first have inferred that one billiard ball would communicate motion to another upon impulse, and that we needed not to have waited for the event in order to pronounce with certainty concerning it.
But what if we had never seen billiards? Would we know what to predict?
The mind can never possibly find the effect in the supposed cause by the most accurate scrutiny and examination. For the effect is totally different from the cause, and consequently can never be discovered in it. Motion in the second billiard ball is a quite distinct event from motion in the first.
So whatever causation is, it's got to be empirically detectable. Well, what is it you see, Hume asks, when you learn causal relations like thrown stones break windows? What you actually see, Hume said, is this and then that. You see the stone reaching the window and the window then breaking. You see the match going along the striker and then igniting.
Suppose then that you have never seen a billiard ball. Your mind is a blank tablet. Are not any number of possibilities equally conceivable?
May not both these balls remain at absolute rest? May not the first ball return in a straight line, or leap off the second in any line or direction? All these suppositions are consistent and conceivable. Why should we then give the preference to one which is no more consistent or conceivable than the rest? All our reasonings a priori will never be able to show us any foundation for this preference. In vain, therefore, should we pretend to determine any single event or infer any cause or effect without the assistance of observation and experience.
We only know about the world, then, through the accumulation of experience. We only know about patterns such as cause and effect by seeing certain events, in Hume's words, constantly conjoined. And we have no reason to think that the causal relationships we have experienced in the past will continue to hold in the future.
For all inferences from experience suppose, as their foundation, that the future will resemble the past, and that similar powers will be conjoined with similar sensible qualities. If there be any suspicion that the course of nature may change, and that the past may be no rule for the future, all experience becomes useless and can give rise to no inference or conclusion. It is impossible, therefore, that any arguments from experience can prove this resemblance of the past to the future, since all these arguments are founded on the supposition of that resemblance.
He points out that there is a logical gap between the proposition that all observed swans are white and the proposition that all swans are white. And he thinks that we cannot bridge that gap between the premise and the conclusion without begging the question, without assuming that nature is uniform, which is precisely what we are trying to establish.
Not surprisingly, when he came to the question of whether we can be certain that our perceptions are backed up by an external world, Hume took the skeptical position.
By what argument can it be proved that the perceptions of the mind must be caused by external objects and could not arise either from the energy of the mind itself or from other cores still unknown to us? It is a question of fact whether the perception of the senses be produced by external objects resembling them. How shall this question be determined? By experience, surely, as all other questions of a like nature. But here experience is and must be entirely silent. The mind has never anything present to it but the perceptions, and cannot possibly reach any experience of their connection with objects.
Still, according to Hume, we have no good reason for believing in the existence of the external world. We have to believe it because of the sorts of beings that we are, but it's not reason that justifies that belief. Nothing justifies our belief in the existence of the external world at all. We believe it on the strength of custom and even more imagination.
So the Humean position, for all its brilliance of argumentation, is, as Hume acknowledges, unstable. There's a marvelous line in which he says, you know, these are the things I think about in my study, but when I play backgammon and I'm with my friends, all of these doubts are forgotten.
Some philosophers continue to be intrigued by skepticism about the existence of the external world, but others consider it a misconception.
I want to reject the whole picture of sensation, especially, that came in with the 17th century. The picture that came in was that somehow sensation is essentially inside us. The picture is that when you look at something, say when you look at the books behind me, you have sensations which came to be conceived of as something taking place in an inner theater. And suddenly the whole world becomes, as it were, taken away from us, becomes problematic. And you have this big discussion, do we really know there's an external world?
We do have perceptual access to the real world. And those arguments to say that we don't are bad arguments. I hold up my hand in front of my face and I really see the hand in front of my face. Of course, there's always a possibility that I could be mistaken or having a hallucination, but in the standard perceptual situation, the reason I see this hand is because there are light waves reflected off it that attack the photons in my retina. The photons attack the retina, they attack the rods and the cones, and eventually sets up a series of neuron firings that produces an actual visual experience directed at this particular hand.
And I want to return to a view that I think is at least, was not so uncommon in ancient medieval philosophy, but I think has been lost as a possibility to us, which is that we actually see books, that we actually experience the external world and not just an internal representation of it.
In their insistence that experience and observation are the only sources of knowledge about the world, empiricists from Locke to the present have felt a close alliance to the natural sciences.
The empiricists, including Locke and Hume especially, were very inspired by Newton's version of the science. Newton's theory of gravity described things that we can observe, like objects, the famous apple falling from the tree and landing near Newton, which inspired him to think about gravity, or the motion of the moon or the motion of the other planets. These are things that can be observed and can be seen. Newton's mathematical description via his theory of gravity is based on what we can infer. As Newton puts it, his theory is inferred from the phenomena.
One of the things that distinguished the empiricists from the rationalists is that they tended to be what we now call naturalists. They tended to adopt naturalistic explanations of empirical phenomena. They tended to play down explanations that were supernatural in nature, or they wanted a systematic story of the world that appealed to the workings of nature, and they thought that they could read off nature's structure from nature itself.
American philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine has been influential in recent developments in both empiricism and philosophy of science.
I don't see a clear boundary between philosophy and science. I see rather gradations. It's a matter of degree. The concepts that philosophy will try to clarify and the rules of evidence or whatever are have to be more general, more fundamental than those of any particular science. There'll be concepts that are shared by all the sciences, and therefore they're not the special business of any of them.
Quine's views are very much like Hume's views in important respects, and people often think of Quine as the 20th century Hume, in that he's a naturalist and an empiricist. The difference between Quine and Hume is that Hume has a narrowly inductive view about the relationship between sense experience on the one hand and our scientific knowledge on the other. Quine's view, by contrast, is much more holistic. He thinks of science as a vast web of interconnected beliefs, which only is related to sensory experience, as he puts it, along the periphery, along the edges of this web. And so we're constantly getting experience, we're getting input coming in from the senses, and what we're doing is we're constantly revising a very large system of beliefs, which is the totality of our scientific knowledge, in response to that input.
Quine believes that scientists, as they work with this vast web of interconnected beliefs, make vital connections between theory and evidence through what he calls observation sentences.
Our evidence for any scientific theory, if we're making an experiment to test the theory by its consequences, is always bound to depend finally on a crucial observation. The theory tells us that if such and such an observable situation were brought about, such and such another observable situation ought to follow. So observation sentences are fundamental to scientific evidence. They're where the evidence lies.
Interestingly, Quine believes that young children learn language through a very similar use of observation sentences.
They are, to begin with, they're occasion sentences, that is to say, sentences which may be true now, will be false a little later, sentences which are just not true once and for all, but like a sentence like it's raining, for instance.
The child sees rain and recognizes the meaning when someone says, "It's raining."
His assent to that sentence, if asked, is immediate, unthinking, unreflective. It's a sentence that he has learned to answer under appropriate observational conditions at the moment, on the spot.
And now what we then start with would be those sentences that we would only assent to or dissent from in the presence of what Quine calls appropriate stimulations. So they are sentences that require our surroundings to be of a certain kind in order for us to be willing to say yes or no if we are asked these sentences.
They're the child's port of entry to cognitive language, to languages in which you make statements of fact or belief. And clearly those are the kind of sentences you learn, the child learns first. The mother says, "Oh, that's a dog." The child repeats the word. The child realizes he's learning that language. He's reached that point. So that's the way he acquires a very significant part of his vocabulary.
Some theories about language learning assert that the basic structures of language are innate to human understanding. Quine disagrees and takes the empiricist position that all language must be learned through observation.
What is it? Orange.
Language is learned only from one another's behavior. The child learns a language from his elders, not by seeing what's going on inside the mind of the person who's using the words and relating the thoughts to the words, but simply by outward signs, what he can observe.
Quine thinks that the main behavior in people that is connected with the use of language is that we understand what other people agree with and what they disagree with by observing their behavior.
And all the meanings that we gather and grasp are learned finally by observing other people's behavior, situations, observing when they, under what circumstances they utter the words.
Yeah, giraffe.
For Quine, there is an innate capacity involved, but it's not innate ideas. Rather, it's an instinct for induction. This instinct underscores Quine's close tie to Hume.
What's he doing?
Induction is the instinct to expect similar events to be followed by events which are in turn similar to each other. This is the basis of all conditioning. All learning is based on conditioning. All learning, therefore, is based on induction.
You want to read it? What are those? Coconuts. Coconuts.
Both rationalism and empiricism were inspired by the scientific revolution. From Copernicus through Newton, a new view of the world was emerging. Even today, rationalists can point to scientific breakthroughs and proclaim, "See how reason puts everything in place?" And empiricists can respond, "Yes, but all the data comes from observation. The world comes first. When the theory fits the world, fine. When it doesn't, change it." The Examined Life is a 26-part series for college credit. To purchase a video cassette or transcript of this program, call 626-796-7300 or visit us online. Please order by program number.